Glasgow?
It's just started to snow and gone pitch black. So it's interesting. Yeah, there's big storm yesterday as well.
I would like to talk a little bit about your choice of the medium, enamel.
Yes,
What do you like about enamel?
I love the surface quality. So basically, I think looking back since I was a child, I loved ceramic tiles. My grandmother had a beautiful kitchen in Essex where she lived with black and white tiles in the kitchen. And being a painter, really, I've been a painter all my life. I've loved the sort of balance of matte and gloss that you can get when you use oil paint. And I started to paint with enamel paint, with extra glossy paint, and then tried vitreous enamel once, and loved it. And so I like the surface quality, the incredible gloss that you get, but I also like the color, incredible color with vitreous enamel.
And you paint on metal.
Steel. I paint on mild steel. So basically, it's an old signage technique. So your old advertising signs or railway signs in the sort of early to middle 20th century were vitreous enamel, which is basically powdered glass, essentially, with other elements fused onto. It would have been cast iron, but as technology got improved, they started to use mild steel sheets. So it's about 1.5 mil thick, more like a steel plate than a steel sheet. It's quite sort of, it's got a nice weight to it. And I apply what's called a ground coat of enamel by spray applying a kind of a liquid enamel. So it's glass powder but mixed into kind of a liquid consistency. And in my spray booth, I can spray apply it to the steel once the steel is perfectly cleaned and grease free. And then that's the ground cut, and then that is fired, and it's kind of like, what's it like? It's like priming your canvas, essentially. And then I might apply a white coat and fire that. And then I've got if you like, my canvas, but it's enamel on steel. And then I paint, if you like, with the color on top of that, and then that is fired.
So you are actually a metal artist and a painter.
Exactly. I'm a painter through and through. You know, that's how my brain works. That's how I think. But yes, I've become a metal artist also through my sort of love of enamel. Signage has beautiful graphic qualities often, and beautiful art qualities often, especially the old signs. You know, when you think of old advertising signs. I found it really interesting to approach it from a purely, I now like making signs. I do make signs, and I've got into the design side, but my painting brain is always going. So I'm also thinking, you know, I love painting with it and getting the illusion of depth in what is a flat surface, which of course is a painterly way of thinking.
You have several pieces in the City of Glasgow College collection.
Yes, I do. Yeah, I've got 2 pieces in that collection. In fact, they were so the first ever time I did vitreous enamel was with the company there's very few companies in Britain that still do this on a big scale. But one of them's in the Isle of Wight, and they make the London Underground signage. So when you come into Tottenham Court Road or whatever the station is, the big signs are vitreous enamel. So they have a huge kiln the size of a shed. I sort of spent a week with them, first time I'd ever done it. And they help you they'll facilitate, because you don't have technical knowledge at that point, or I didn't. So they help you to make some artworks. And I basically improvised, used my painterly improvisation sort of practice, and I improvised 2 pieces. I made 4 or 5 little, very experimental pieces, and then I made 2 big ones. And those 2 pieces are in the collection at City of Glasgow College. Yeah, I was very happy with them. Sometimes when you just go for it, things work out.
This medium enamel gives your art additional depth.
I think it does. It's I think that's partly to do with the color. I really love using color, and I through my painting practice, I know how to balance one color off another color. And I also love edges, sharp edges or hard edges versus diffused or blurred edges. So I can, and those are two of the main ingredients for making the illusion of 3-dimensional depth, really, in painting. And I think it's a bit unusual. Most signage, of course, was quite hard. Most graphic designers or sort of sign makers might be thinking more hard-edged. But I can muck about with my edges when I'm painting with enamel and with the color as well. And that creates this illusion of depth, this illusion of 3-dimensional depth, which is a little bit unusual, I think, in enamel. I mean, other people do it, but it's quite unusual, I think.
They also look a bit like holograms. It's almost like you can walk into them.
Oh, well, that's lovely to hear. That's a very interesting thing to point out. Yeah, I think I get lost in them when I make them. Absolutely lost. When I'm improvising something, which I love to do, I get lost in them like a dream world. And it's definitely a space-based dream world. So I'm very pleased if viewers experience that as well.
Behind you, is that your piece?
It is. So that was one of those first week 5 experimental pieces, which I made on that first trip, which unbelievably kind of just worked. Some of the guys I was working with, who are perhaps more from an engineering side than an art side, although actually through working with them, I realized there's not actually that, there's a big Venn diagram overlap. They were very interested in how things look, and I'm also very interested in how you do it. So there was quite a meeting of minds, actually, but they were quite worried that I was improvising pieces because it's quite expensive stuff. And you could easily, they've had people, if you don't have a plan, you might muck it up. But these pieces are improvised, but I'm very used to improvising and practiced at it, I suppose. So they worked out, and they seem to, I mean, they do get failures. Everyone that improvises things gets failures. I'm now able to do it in a way that that doesn't happen too often. And I can usually turn something into something else if I'm improvising. And it doesn't, well, actually, I don't really have a set plan. I love to make things where I don't know exactly what it's going to be. Keeps me interested. If you like, I can show you a close-up of this piece. I can just bring it over.
Can you bring it here?
Yeah, I can. So you can get a sense of the glossiness of the surface.
How do you choose your oils?
Well, you mean oils as in when I'm oil painting, or do you mean oils as in when I'm doing enamel?
When you're doing enamel, because I'm thinking, it needs to be adhesive.
Well, I'll explain that. So yeah, so I kind of treat it, I suppose, I think we can't call it oils because it's not oil paint, but what we can call it is color. And I know what you mean, because I do treat it like oil paint. So basically I've got my white coated piece of, well, ground and white coated piece of steel. Then there's 2 other ways of applying the color, really. One is I can spray apply it. So I've learned to, and it's water mixable, and I can spray it with a spray gun that you would paint a car with. So the piece I just showed you is partly spray applied black enamel. But there's another way of applying enamel, which is where the enamel powder is mixed with, I think it's pine oil. So it is quite like oil paint in that regard. And you can mix it into something that very much resembles oil paint. So you could apply it with a brush. You can also screen print it. So I've got into screen printing images. When you've sprayed it, so whether you've sprayed the water mixable version or whether you have printed or painted the oil mixable version, then you have to dry it. So all the moisture has gone out of it. And then you have to fire it. And after the firing, at about between 700 and 800 degrees Celsius, then it becomes hard and glass-like. But after you've painted it, pre-firing, you could actually just wipe it off with your finger because it's not fused, it's not being heated and melted into its glass state. You did ask me a question, which is how I choose the color. Was that? Yeah. Sorry, I didn't actually answer that bit. So it's very much like oil paint in that regard, especially with the oil mixable version. So I learned to mix my colors at art school at Glasgow School of Art, and I have 2 of each primary. So I have a cold and a warm of each primary color. So maybe lemony yellow, cadmium red, alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, which is a purpley blue, and something like a phthalo, which is a greeny blue, and white. And I can mix pretty much most colors that I want to mix through my painting knowledge. I can mix them. So it is very similar to how I use my oil paints. Yeah.
I noticed that your palette is very diverse. It ranges from monochromatic to very vibrant paintings.
Yeah, that's right. I think I very much like color. I love using color, but I also like working monochrome with black and white. It's a bit like I go into what I would call a drawing side of my brain when I'm using black and white. So sometimes it's quite nice to just cut the color out and think about forms and composition and shape. And so I like doing both. I like working black and white, but I also love experimenting with color.
Let's talk a little bit about the titles of your. You have spore producing diploid.
Yes.
Working haploid.
Yeah.
What are you talking about?
Well, good question. I personally think calling everything untitled is a bit boring. You know, I understand why people do it. I did it for ages. Or, you know, you could call your paintings number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. That's fine. I like to give them titles, but because they are dream worlds, because I've invented these dream worlds, I don't want to call them something too specific or knowable. So if I call, you know, I have to be careful. If I call it, I don't know, figure in front of a blue sky or something, that's way too leading for the, well, it isn't that, but if it looks a bit like that, the viewer is just going to take that from it. So I have to call it something obscure, but I also don't want it to be meaninglessly obscure. So the way that I made some of those paintings you're talking about, those are actually, I mean, some of them are actually paintings, oil paintings. So some of them are oil paintings on hardboard or masonite, I think is also called. This is hard to do with the enamel on steel, but with the oil paintings on board, I sometimes cut into them after I've made them and rearrange the pieces into a new collaged painting. And I started researching, I started thinking about grafting, like plants. Plants, you can graft one kind of plant into another one and produce a third plant. And so those terms that you've picked up on are actually they're technical terminology for people that graft plants and make a third plant. So it makes it, hopefully it's intriguing. So it sounds a bit alien. And I think my work, I like the fact my work is a bit unknowable. I like to think if you owned one, you'd still be wondering about it in 10 years' time, and it would still be entertaining you, because they do me. I make work to sort of entertain myself, and I'm still not bored looking at them. So because I don't know what they are.
You have a small series on unidentical twin.
That may be to do with making two paintings, and then taking out, with a laser cutter, taking out the same sized piece from each of those works and swapping them. So they're twins, but they're not identical. I love symmetry and I love asymmetry, and I like the uncanny. I like things to remind you of something but be slightly wrong or slightly different. I think perfection's a little boring for me. I like things to be interestingly slightly off, and then I'm interested in them.
You mentioned laser cut. How do you do that?
Yeah, well, a laser cutter is an amazing piece of modern technology where you can cut all sorts of things. You can cut paper, you can cut thin board and thin plywood. So I've been getting into cutting finished paintings where I've stopped painting them and they're dry, and I can cut into them with shapes with a laser cutter. And it's such an accurate mode of cutting that it's perfect. It's a perfect jigsaw. So if you cut two shapes out of two separate pieces and it's the same shape, they'll fit exactly. So yeah, collage has always been a big part of my painting practice. Cutting into paintings and moving pieces around. In fact, some of my early oil paintings, although they look whole, and they are whole, they're offcuts from bigger paintings. So I would improvise quite a large painting, and then I would cut out a section of it that I couldn't have predicted and make a new composition out of that unpredictable offcut. That's been a part of my painting practice for years. Hard to do with enamel on steel. Not so easy. You can't use a laser cutter to cut into a whole piece of enamel very easily. But yeah, I can pre-cut the pieces. So yeah. So through getting into making, if you like, paintings with enamel, I suddenly felt like super interested in the idea of making some objects for the home, which people might want to own. So I mean, partly it's to do with, how can one as a fine artist make a living, which isn't always easy. I suddenly got very interested and very excited about making things rather than just, well, I say just, I love them, but abstract pieces. Yeah, I just thought about what are the cool things that one could make with vitreous enamel, as well as signage. I do commissioned bespoke signs for people, for houses, or for small businesses. The other thing I came up with was wall clocks. It's fun also to design things which are round. I'm used to working on squares or rectangles. And also, I think it was a way for me to develop my screen printing skills, because I'm relatively new to screen printing. And so I started by making coasters, to put your cut down on, and then clocks, so I could screen print the numbers in enamel. That is, so that always, whenever I say screen print, it's not screen printing ink, it's enamel, and then I fire it and it becomes glass. So yeah, it was partly experimenting with the process and also thinking, what might I be able to sell to people? I think there's lots of potential for the clocks. I'm still finding out, I'm still experimenting with what I'm making and how I'm making it. You know, it can cost quite a lot to redecorate an entire room, for instance, but an enamel clock with incredible color in it, even in a room that's undecorated, can look pretty amazing. Also, I think the enamel surface just works with a clock face. It just looks really lovely. And I'm thinking of, I haven't got there quite yet, but I'm thinking of watches, of wristwatches. I've bought some antique, but quite old wristwatches, and I'm going to try and take out the dial. They're fairly sort of, you know, they're not collectible as they are, although the mechanism works and they're quite, you know, they're quite nice wee watches. But I think with an enamel dial, they could be amazing. So that's a plan as well. Yeah, Paulin. They are a Glasgow-based company, very cool company, who make watches and clocks. And there's two companies, Paulin and Anne Ordain. Anne Ordain is they actually make super incredible watches where they enamel the dial, super collectible. Paulin is the more affordable end of the spectrum, so I think you might pay more like you know, £500 or £700 for a watch. So, but they're two super cool companies, and that Anne Ordain, they were super amazed to find that I existed, because I've been building this studio in the East End of Glasgow. Somebody introduced me to Lewis, who runs Anne Ordain, and he couldn't believe there was someone down the road making enamel clocks, because I think Anne Ordain are the only company I know of who make enamel watch faces. There may be nobody else that does that, actually. So it was quite funny that I was half a mile down the road, and we made friends, and they had the idea of this exhibition where 5 artists, I was one of them, would it was nothing to do with enamel. We actually just hand painted or screen printed clock faces in limited, I think we did 5 each, so limited edition, and they were sold on their website. That's right, yeah. So I've been learning quite a bit about the history of enameling in Scotland, because as far, I mean, hopefully someone will tell me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, I'm the only person in Scotland making sort of enamel panels. There'll be lots of jewelers using enamel. It was interesting to start to research whether this, you know, where this happened in the last century. And Falkirk is the place where all the foundries were. There were, I think it was something like, I mean, there were dozens of foundries in the Falkirk area of Scotland, which is about half an hour's drive from Glasgow. And yeah, so I got some funding to do some research on the enameling that was done in these foundries. So they used to, they were cast iron mostly, and they would make baths and pans and stoves. But there was a big craze of coating everything in enamel in the early part of the 20th century. Everything was enameled. And they also had a signage part of these foundries where they would make signs. So your great, you know, your great big Cadbury's chocolate sort of advertising sign on the side of a house 75 years ago was enamel and built to last forever. And so yeah, I got some funding from VACMA, VACMA, in Scotland, and they gave me some money to go and research enameling techniques in the Falkirk archives. And I was able to go to Callender House, and actually they brought some of their actual objects for me to have a look at and photograph and see. And I learned quite a lot about the process and the history. And yeah, I like, one of the signs I looked at was bent in a sort of L shape, so it stuck out from the wall. And that got me interested in folding the steel using a metal folding or bending machine, and then enameling the folded steel. So I got some more sculptural objects out of that. Yeah, it was great fun.
Then I noticed that you are doing portraits, which are very different from the other work.
Yes, well, I started, my painting life really began with portraiture. I just loved, and still do love, painting portraits. And so I taught myself really to paint portraits in my early 20s. Yeah, sort of taught myself on the job, and I started getting portrait commissions from local people, friends of friends, friends of family. And I just fell in love with painting portraits. And that's something I've always done, and I still like doing it. So I still get portrait commissions occasionally, and I enjoy doing them. And it's for a while, I suppose when I went to art school, which I did when I was about 30 years old, was after I'd become a portrait painter. And I went to art school to experiment, to try other things, and had a great time doing it, and started making these improvised abstract paintings. But there's still a part of me that also loves figurative painting. And there's aspects of figurative painting in my abstract work, like the illusion of depth comes from my figurative painting skills.
Your latest solo show, Accidental Transport?
Yeah, that was in the Beacon Arts Centre in Greenock, and quite a cool space, which is it's a big glass building right on the Clyde. So half of the building is glass looking out onto the Clyde, and there's a big sort of foyer downstairs and upstairs. And so I had a solo exhibition in there, and this was last year, and it was great. It was a chance for me to sort of show a bit of everything. So I showed enamel paintings, and I showed not screen prints, monoprints, black and white monoprints, and I showed a laser cut oil painting, and also a couple of ceramic works where it's actually enamel paint on ceramic tile, which I made a few years ago, which is the sort of thing that led on to me thinking about vitreous enamel, which is enamel on steel. Well, in my case, enamel on steel. But I think the idea of enamel paint can be slightly confusing for people because it's called enamel, but it isn't actually enamel. It's just glossy paint. We call it enamel paint, but it's not. There's nothing glass about it. But yeah, the show I really enjoyed. I was quite pleased with that process.
You seem to spend a lot of time in your shop. You're very reclusive.
Well, I'm actually quite unreclusive. Well, it's a funny thing. It's I suppose that's my happy place. You know, like you know, a musician, their happy place is playing the trumpet. You know, you don't. An artist, your happy place is mucking around with a collage. So time just flies. You don't, you know, sometimes I'm frustrated and I'm thinking, oh God, you know, this is all very expensive and I'm not earning much and very difficult. And most of the other times I'm thinking, wow, I get to play with this stuff and it's super exciting all the time. I must admit, in my enameling studio, I'm used to painting studios where they're more open plan and you get to hang out more with other people who are also painting in the painting studio. Mainly I've worked in sort of communal spaces, and my enamel workshop is a sort of old bathroom in an industrial space. So I open the door and it's just me. So it is a bit more reclusive in that regard, but I soon forget about that when I'm working. And the other thing is I've met some great people through working with enamel. People find it very interesting, and I'm always having interesting conversations with people about it. Yeah, it can feel kind of solitary, but it's fun. It's fun solitary, and you're also meeting people.
How can people find your work?
So my website, Jim Ramsay Studio, .com. They can find pretty much everything I do is on that website, and there's contact details, but there's also a shop, my shop on the website, Bridgeton Enamel, which is my name for my shop, and it's just things that I make. There's nobody else's stuff on there. So you can buy directly from the shop, things like clocks, but the artwork, the thing to do would just be email me, and I could send people a price list, or they can inquire about individual works which are on the website. Instagram also, Jim Ramsay Studio. Instagram is a very good way to keep abreast of what I'm doing or to contact me.
My name's Jim Ramsay. I'm an artist. I've been an artist all my life, but the last 5 years I got fascinated by vitreous enamel, which is glass fused to steel sheet in a kiln. Being a painter, I've found that I can make signage, which I'm enjoying doing, but I can also paint in it. After cleaning the steel so it's totally grease-free, you can apply the powdered glass in various different ways, but first off usually with a ground coat a specially formulated coat of enamel which bonds really well to the steel surface. And then it's a process of applying layers. Often you'll apply a white coat and then you'll fire that in the kiln at a different temperature. And then maybe some coloured imagery will go on the top. And that will then be fired in the kiln again at a different temperature. And you end up with a beautiful surface that looks like one surface, but is essentially layers of coloured glass fused into one surface. And it's very hard wearing, lasts for maybe 100 years easily, more if it's inside. I've been teaching myself an awful lot of processes. Screen printing is another thing that I hadn't done much of, but I really love the process. There's so many different aspects to it that you need to get right, like the thickness of the application of the emulsion, the pressure when you push down on the squeegee. Like I say, I also really passionately think it's a medium and a surface that has a future because it's so practical and so long-lasting. It's extremely beautiful. There's no surface quite like glass enamel.